Hello, my name is Keith Machowski, and I am a librarian and professor here at the New York City College of Technology. This talk is a collaboration between New York City College of Technology's Ursula C. Schwerin Library and Queensborough Community College's Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center in support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's traveling exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust, which examines how Americans reacted to Nazism, war, refugees, and genocide before and during the Second World War. City Tech's library was one of 50 libraries selected to host the exhibition, which is on display through December 17th, 2023. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Ray Walpow Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in White Plains, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati, and the Institute for Human Rights at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'd like to thank Dr. Laura Cohen, Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center, and Marissa Hollywood, the Kupferberg Center's Associate Director. And I'd like to thank also Professor Monica Berger from City Tech's Ursula C. Schwerin Library, and the many others too who played a role in making today's event happen, not least the American Library Association and the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. We've done more than a dozen class tours with students and others in recent weeks, and one of the biggest takeaways has been the correlation between the Nuremberg Race Laws and America's Jim Crow system, the apparatus of oppression that existed by law in the American South and by practice in the North since the time of Reconstruction. Some brief context. In his Atlanta Compromise speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in 1895, Booker T. Washington advocated that African Americans should take an accommodationist approach to civil rights. That is, he encouraged that African Americans essentially be patient and bide their time in the search for equality. Congress passed the Mann Act, formerly known as the White Slave Traffic Act, in 1910, ostensibly to combat human trafficking, but in reality used to punish interracial relationships. And in the 1910s, there was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the film release of Birth of a Nation. The eugenics movement was at its zenith in this period. And in 1916, Madison Grant offered readers a pseudo-scientific history and anthropology of the races in his best-selling publication, The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. It was in this milieu that Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists rose in the 1920s and 30s. Here today to discuss the correlation between the American and German systems is Thomas White, Coordinator of Educational Outreach at the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. So, Professor White, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome everybody, and good afternoon to this presentation. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And so we have a number of things to begin with on the screen, and the idea of ethical questions that are raised, looking back on Holocaust memory. The title of the presentation of White Purity, Eugenics, Ideology, and Mass Murder. White purity, of course, is back amongst us with the white supremacist movement. What kind of questions will this presentation raise, given our current situation and circumstances? Eugenics defined here on screen, the idea of sort of breeding better human stock. We'll get into that a little bit more. Down below, field test by Nazi Germany, which in turn will be modeled after much of what the US had done previous to that. The questions we're going to raise in this presentation are, Why and how does an elitist, anti-democratic, white supremacist, race-based, unscientific movement become popular and shape the norms in the United States? Does US eugenics policy have an impact on or any connection to Nazi race policy and indeed race murder? And finally, it is very important for healthy democracies to confront very difficult history. This, of course, will resonate throughout the presentation. I'll start here with an image of the Hadamard Institute, now part of the Action T4 movement, with sort of the warning that in retrospect, everything seems inevitable. But in turn, nothing is inevitable. And we're going to see a series of graduating and escalating events that would lead to the mass murder. So we know that mass atrocity is not an event, but a process. And that's what we hope to unfold today. There are three threads because of the limited time of this presentation that I'm going to focus on. The United Kingdom, United States, and then Germany. It's not going to be a smooth and easy line. They're going to intersect throughout this history, but those will be my three focal points. In the end, the Hadamard Institute that you see here with the smoke coming from the chimney from the gas chamber of this particular hospital in Germany, this is where the Nazis will learn all the techniques that they'll later deploy in the killing camps in Poland. How is it the United Kingdom and the United States influenced German ideas? We're going to start, first of all, with context, and the context for where do these ideas come from, for me, would be the 19th century. When you have massive social turmoil, those in power are wondering about what the future might look like. And there are two explosive social events taking place in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, of course, and then the series of revolutions, starting with the French Revolution, that will work into the 1830s and 1840s in Europe. These were massive social changes that literally were earthquakes to how people saw the world and how they saw their place in it. From these massive social changes caused by the Industrial Revolution, you're going to have growing states worried about overpopulation in the cities, the crime rates, and the disease that therefore follows, and changing norms and rules. And so what you're going to see in England, for example, where eugenics will begin, is the repeal of the medieval idea of who was to give social charity. And that was the churches and institutions like that. But instead, that was now being transferred as a responsibility of the state, which meant state budget oversight, which meant limited funds to be applied now to social situation. At the same time, England was facing emigration from their colonies, again, challenging what was perceived, of course, as white Britain. And in this case, this is where those in power began to designate who were the right types of people and the wrong type of people. And so we'll start with England in what is really an elitist movement that is really kind of on the fringe. It's in a sort of a small group of folks. And we'll start with Francis Galton, who is a scientist and a mathematician and Darwin's half cousin, who is enamored, of course, by Darwin's work and especially Darwin's popularity, and is wishing to find his niche into that scientific world. And he decides that what Darwin was talking about natural selection, doesn't really apply to humanity for one particular reason. Humanity interferes. Charity is given to those who are poor. And this, of course, is unnatural in Galton's point of view. And so when he starts talking about natural selection, he's talking about human beings should remove themselves from social welfare initiatives that does not allow nature to pursue its course. In 1883, he coins the term eugenics. And the idea was, how do we breed better human beings using science so that poverty and crime and disease starts to disappear? So this is going to be a scientific approach to issues that they were seeing because of these social revolutions. That was positive eugenics from the point of view of Francis Galton, which was, we're going to work to improve the world. The flip side of that, or maybe not flip, but additional side, would be negative eugenics. Herbert Spencer, another Englishman, is focused on Darwin as well, and will coin the term survival of the fittest. For him, he will go a step further and not just observing that nature isn't working its course, but that human beings should now do things that will allow nature to do its course. Negative eugenics meant we are not going to give aid to the poor or those we designate as inferior. And in this case, he believes, in the well-placed world that he lived in, that this would therefore allow those who are criminals, who are promiscuous, or other moral projections onto the poor, would they be allowed to die, and therefore decrease those issues in society. He believes that the traits of criminality, promiscuity, and there'll be a whole list coming up here, are basically inherited, that these are genetic. It has nothing to do with education or society or upbringing, but it has to do solely with genes. And so for him, inferior people that they will define, I'll tell you in a moment how those people are going to be defined, should not reproduce, they should not intermarry. Instead, they should be segregated, sterilized, and cut off from any social safety net. With limited funds of the government, that money should go to the people who deserve it. And of course, they're going to define who does not. So the resources that are limited, apparently, will go only to the superior people, and now we'll have the beginning of the eugenics idea. Anti-Semitism is always part of eugenics. I'm going to weave that throughout. It may not be as obvious, but I'll try to bring out that throughout this presentation. So there was England. We kind of stuck our toe in there, and now we're going to go to Germany. So a separate kind of projection here, or trajectory, about what will be their eugenics program. And we're going to go to Southwest Africa, where the first genocide of the 20th century took place. In 1897, German colonial occupiers began to colonize Southwest Africa, current-day Namibia. And in imagining what that might look like, geographer Friedrich Ratzel coined the term Lebensraum, a term you'll later hear, of course, in Nazi Germany, but this is its origin. The idea was that as we colonized Africa, we need geographic space, so we must expand our empire in Africa in order to stay in the people, the folk, the settlers, the colonizers who are going into Africa. We must constantly expand or perish due to lack of resources. So the idea is, of course, we must steal other people's resources. If this sounds at all familiar, this, of course, is Nazi policy that will lead them to the Second World War. Only the people with strong agricultural base could flourish. Later, when Hitler adopts this idea for Nazi Germany, he is imagining the same thing in Eastern Europe. He has plans to devastate major cities and urban areas and replace them with farmer settlers. 1904-07, you have a revolt of native people in Southwest Africa, namely the Herero and Namakwa people, who are then annihilated by European technology. And in this case, this is where the terms superior race and subhumans begin to enter the lexicon of German colonizers. And the idea was that you must brutally put down these native uprisings, Black people, against their colonization. This is the first time we see Germans deploy concentration camps, modeled on what the British had been doing in South Africa. We see also a killing camp in the colony Shark Island, where people were deported here specifically to be murdered. I think we start seeing in an imagination what is later possible in Nazi Germany. The question is there a direct connection? And I think there are. So I want to start here with Eugene Fisher. He is an anthropologist who goes to Southwest Africa to study in concentration camps the impact of the superior race doing policies to an inferior race. He is very interested in doing medical examinations and experiments to Black people interned in these camps. If that sounds familiar, it should. Fisher will have a leading role to play in the Third Reich. So he conducts his medical experiments here to reconfirm his idea in race superiority. And so the medical experiments include sterilization, injection of smallpox, typhus, TB, on what he designates as the white European inferior races of the captured people. He recommends that these people should not be allowed to reproduce or intermarry, which will become policy in all the German colonies after he advocates for it. When he returns back home to Germany, he will receive for his medical school body parts from the victims in these camps. And it raises another question, of course, when you have skeletons in classrooms throughout the world, where do those skeletons come from? Which is also another interesting side story here. Now, Fisher's important. On the eve of World War I, he writes a book, Rehoboth Bastards and the Problem of Intermarriage Among Humans. And he writes, one should grant them, the inferior races, the amount of protection that an inferior race confronting us, note the militant term, requires for us to survive, and only for as long as they are of any use to us. So you have here already this idea of self-defense being manufactured as scientific progress, that we're defending ourselves from this racial threat. This book will directly influence Hitler as he writes Mein Kampf. So this is one of his main sources. It's also interesting to see what Nazi parents were up to. The governor of Southwest Africa was Heinrich Goering. You might have heard the name Hermann Goering, who was, of course, his son. And Hermann grew up with wonderful tales of the white superior race and how we enslave the inferior races. And this becomes sort of his nighttime imagination going to bed of what is possible, perhaps, in his own future. Franz Rode von Epp, another German officer who spent time in Namibia after World War I, will be one of the leaders of Freikorps, of a paramilitary after the war. And when he comes back and he forms his paramilitary, which is Battalion Epp outside of Munich, from 1919 to 28, you're going to notice a lot of top Nazis were in his Freikorps. And you've got from Ernst Röhm, who later lead the brown shirts. And we think when you look at brown shirt uniforms, there are a couple of reasons. There's a warehouse with a stockpile of old colonial outfits that were not worn. But at the same time, I want you to imagine a young Hermann Goering imagining stories of his father in colonial khaki, abusing the natives as sort of a power symbol. So I think when you look at who else is here, Rudolf Hess, who helps Hitler write Mein Kampf, or at least writes down his dictation, and Hitler himself, who's employed as Epp's educator, instilling fear about Bolshevism and communism. Epp will later be appointed by Hitler to be the governor of Bavaria, who will then oversee the building of Dachau outside of Munich. So I see German colonial uniform here, and to me, the mirror image in Nazi Germany of guys like Hermann Goering who have fantasized that childhood stories that his father would tell. So we've now started the thread of the German momentum here, and now let's go to the US. To this point, you have, I think, an intellectual fringe moment in the UK and in Germany. What makes it mainstream is the United States. And so I have a lot of pieces of the puzzle now to try to put together as best I can about what will bring it together here. I think it's important to quote a rally from President Trump when he said, he looked out at a crowd in Minnesota of mostly white people, and he said, "You have good genes. A lot of it is about the genes, isn't it? Don't you believe? The racehorse theory. You have good genes in Minnesota." The racehorse theory, of course, is that people are born genetically superior and that selective breeding can improve the country, or eugenics. In the United States, it really begins to take off in the progressive era. These are people who had come to power. Their memory, their experience was the Civil War. And so they remembered, and their parents were diligent about following the rule of law, using science and reason to avoid conflict again. So they're very much shaped by that environment. And then the education system changes in the US, where classical learning, Latin, Greek, all that is sort of replaced now with this idea of public service. And so these things all combine. And so now this generation begins to see a higher moral purpose in public service, in political reform, and social reform. And what are they facing? They're facing now what the British faced at the part of the 19th century, rapid urbanization caused by the Industrial Revolution. So the same kind of force is now on a much larger scale here in the United States. Immigration, obviously post-Civil War, all that is going on. So they're seeking reform, and they want to utilize, and they trust, experts, or those that can define themselves as experts in how to solve problems scientifically. 1895, Connecticut passes the first eugenic law forbidding intermarriage amongst the races. This is repealed, of course, in 1967. May 1897, Michigan is the first state to introduce mandatory sterilization for those deemed inferior, of what they describe as criminals and degenerates. And of course, easy to access because they're in prison, they're already under state custody, easy to get access to them. But of great interest, it fails to pass. This will all change within about 20 years. These early legislation go nowhere. It's the fringe movement, but that will change pretty rapidly. Charles Davenport is one of the leading figures in the American eugenics movement out of New York City. And to quote him, where the life of the state is threatened, extreme measures may and must be taken. So he's a wealthy scientist who establishes something called the Eugenics Record Office here in New York. That will operate from 1910 to 1939. Note the date, because what you're going to see is a parallel development in Nazi Germany of the eugenics movement that simultaneously there'll be a pullback in the United States. And by 1939, the funding will cease because they're witnessing what the Nazis are doing. But right now, that's not quite the case here on the timeline. About 1911 or so, he gets fixated on what he'll call defectives that he defines as insane, feeble-minded people, epileptics, blind, etc. And as a scientist, he now betrays his training by now trying to find evidence to support his conclusion rather than the other way around. He argues that these people should be sterilized, and now he searches for data to support what he calls a single gene theory that he picked up from a study in Germany. There's a whole sort of trace here I don't want to go into, but he's going to believe the very, we now know, unscientific idea that behavioral traits are traced to a single gene. He said, I can tell you why a man can go to sea or wants to go to sea if I can find that one gene inside of him. We now know, of course, this is ludicrous, right? Genes interact each other. There's nature, there's nurture. It's very complicated, but that's what he was operating under, the premise. So he hires a PhD from Princeton to direct the Eugenics Record Office to do the field research to support his conclusion. And his name, of course, is Harry Laughlin. Laughlin is going to be financed by Carnegie, Rockefeller, and a certain Mrs. E.H. Harriman, who had inherited her husband's wealth and gave it to Laughlin and Davenport. By the way, the use of money, interestingly here, as you get these sort of racist projects underway and they're well-funded, other philanthropists, for example, Julius Rosenwald, takes his fortune and he builds 5,000 schools for African Americans. I'm going to mention that again because eugenics tests get all messed up when you test educated Black people versus uneducated Black people, and that will be a problem. But I would argue that's a much better use of money. Davenport and Laughlin create what they call the trait book, which they list 3,500 what they decide are hereditary traits that all come from single genes. So there are 3,500 genes out there they're about to identify that they can trace back to human behavior, each one given a number. And then the research begins. As I title this, let the collection of meaningless data begin. But Laughlin will send out teams now into the field. Interestingly enough, this coincides with the suffragette movement. And you're going to have a lot of young women from wealthy families from East Coast colleges wanting to show their mettle and their skill and ability. And they make up much of the research teams that hit the road and start trying to find those single genes. Most of the research they're about to do is done in cooperation with state institutions, mental houses, poorhouses, that kind of thing, only because they have easy access to the patients, which on a basic scientific level already skews the results because wealthy families aren't putting their children in these homes, i.e. the Kennedy family is a more modern example of this. So already, you know, the results are going to be skewed in a certain direction. Graduating here with their trait book, ready to go into the field after their number of weeks of training, here is one of the groups ready to go, and they have their family tree here of the Homocock family, a nut study. That's right. So they're going out to find what they're looking for and where will they get the data. The field workers are expected to make these kind of determinations, and they'll go out with a single index card to interview a person. They'll list the numbers from the trait book and say, there's the human gene of this particular individual. And what do they have to determine things like hair and skin color, hair texture. Can they retain urine? Is someone easily offended? If someone asked me, can you retain urine? I think I'd be easily offended, right? So I think these things all kind of work together. And suffer from wanderlust is one of my favorites. Philosophical tendencies. That will have an inference to Jews, as well as we'll get into this a little bit as well. But that's what they're looking for. Now, if people aren't available, they make a schedule to visit and they're going to interview a certain person at an institution and they're not there. It's okay. Interview people who might know them and hear what they have to say as innuendo and that kind of thing. And so that can be seen hearsay as scientific evidence, and they collect terrific evidence here. 750,000 index cards that are so valuable that they're stored in a fireproof vault at the Eugenics Record Office. This is the gold mine of data to support eugenics, and all it really is a revelation of the social prejudices of the day that they just reconfirm for themselves. Who's paying attention to all this? Well, the funders, of course, but the Germans. Now, the Germans, to this point, this has been a fringe movement. Suddenly, the Americans seem to be getting funding and traction, and they become very interested in both those ideas. How do you get funding and traction for eugenics work? And this is when things start crossing over. So Charles Davenport in New York starts communicating with, I've listed a couple here, Ernst Rudin, and of course, I'll mention another one here in a second. It starts here, Fisher, we already mentioned too, who's doing those medical experiments in Southwest Africa. And they all start talking to each other. Rudin wants an exhibit in Germany to sort of create a public buzz about racial hygiene, the Nazi term for eugenics. And Fisher, who is he? We already saw him in Southwest Africa doing medical experiments. He'll later become the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is modeled on the Eugenics Record Office, and also therefore gets the funding of Carnegie, and I think Rockefeller as well. The German equivalent of Eugenics Record Office, it's funded by Rockefeller. There we go. Fisher becomes the leading racial hygienicist or eugenicist in Nazi Germany, and he helps craft the Nuremberg Laws. One of his students is Josef Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz. Rudin becomes the head of another wing of the Institute, of course, this one for psychology, and he's the prime author of the Nazi sterilization law in 1933. So we start to ask questions here about what kind of mixing of ideas and policies are taking place. Is any of this connected? What is the connection with the Nuremberg laws and the first Nazi sterilization law to US thinkers? Very dramatic as I lifted the curtain there. I was very impressed with myself with that. Anyway, let's focus on another important shift, which is the shift toward misogyny. We know that there isn't a mass atrocity crime that has not included misogyny as one of its major motivations. And in this case, eugenics starts to pick up momentum when they start shifting its focus to women. Let me go a step further. The image you can't quite see because it's blocked out is one woman here, and they're measuring her head with the calibers as the men look on. I think it's a woman as well looking on as to what she's doing. So let's look at the next American, Henry Goddard, again, well-educated scientist who has discovered an IQ test that had started in France, and he wants to now apply it to the US to measure people's intelligence, which he thinks is inherited. And he creates categories of morally defective people based on those IQ tests. These are feeble-minded people, he says, and he creates three terms that are now common in our lexicon: idiot, imbecile, and moron. And by the IQ test, an idiot would be a person with a mental age of 2 or less, imbecile 3 to 7 years old in their mental development, and a moron, a person with a mental age of 8 to 12. Now, for you guys here present, of these three categories, which one to Goddard is the most threatening to the white race? The idiot, the imbecile, or the moron? Why the moron? Right. Almost there. They can pass. How are you going to tell? I mean, the other people you can tell, you can, let them die and that kind of thing. But someone who's close enough to passing, And often women often do that, don't they, to try to marry wealthy people and that kind of thing. So the focus begins to shift on the moron. And so the most dangerous of the feeble-minded people are the people who are almost intelligent enough to pass as decent human beings. Morons can be literate, can fully function in society, but they're ill. And their will is weak. They can't resist things like crime and prostitution because it's all part of their genes. And that's what we're trying to help stop. So they're easily influenced people. Note the moral tone going on here as well. So they appear normal, but really they can't lead productive lives. So progressive activists and conservatives worry about those who are easily influenced by bad morality, who can't control their sexual urges. Interestingly enough, if you now go into U.S. race history and you look at the plantation South, and you look at plantation owners who had systemically raped their Black slaves, that has now been put in the background after the Civil War, right? And all that is projected onto the Black people by white people who, of course, don't have any account for what had happened. The projection of sexual virility and rapists, all that kind of stuff, are projected onto Blacks, onto Jews, by those who, of course, were practicing those behaviors just before the Civil War. But especially the poor, especially poor women who are having a lot of children and therefore can't control themselves, according to this ideology. So poor women are going to be judged as feeble-minded and morally defective and therefore need our help. The shift comes when there's a breakthrough in sterilization, which went from castrating males to then sterilizing women. And that takes place about 1880, the first modern sterilization against women here, which is, they argue, the males who are in charge, because women still don't have the right to vote, that this is a much more humane, scientific, progressive way to deal with the issue because we're not castrating males. We're just targeting women. Louis Terman from Stanford: not all criminals are feeble-minded, but all feeble-minded persons are at least potential criminals. But here's the kicker of the line, that every feeble-minded woman is a potential prostitute would hardly be disputed by anyone, except anyone who might be thinking, but that's a bit sarcastic. So with that in mind, Goddard now writes a book, 1912, The Kolokok Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. This is the moment where the fringe idea becomes mainstream. This is a popular bestseller, and it's a story. So here he is. He has a home. He's a philanthropic scientific fellow. He has a home in New Jersey for the education and care of feeble-minded children. And there's a woman here. She's 22 years old. Her name is Emma Wolverton. And she is determined to be unusually flirtatious. Now, there's only one reason a woman is so flirtatious, is that she's trying to make her way into the upper class, perhaps. And the only people who do that, of course, are the morons. And so right away, he thinks this is one of those moronic behaviors with an agenda. And so he writes a book, pseudo at best scientific, he makes most of this up, where he discovers a morality tale that he selectively reinforces with selective evidence. He traces Emma's history back to her great-great-great-grandfather, who was a Revolutionary War hero who had a problem. One day, coming back from the battle, he stopped at an inn and a tavern where he spent the night with the barmaid, and I'm going to be sarcastic here. Men make mistakes, they are to be forgiven. They face combat. It's a hard thing to be a man. But of course, he then traces the line because he goes back to his wife, whereby he breeds kids with her and has the model family values. But he had this one mistake, and every guy's allowed one mistake, sarcasm. And of course, he then traces the line. The degenerate line is the line between the soldier and the barmaid. And just by some weird, mysterious coincidence, every single one of them are all moronic, idiots, feeble-minded people. And everybody from the line from his wife, who went home to be a decent human being again, was, of course, all college-educated, wonderfully happy people. Both conservatives and progressives read this book and get an answer to what they've been asking about. So for conservatives who are focused on sexual purity and morality, there's clearly evidence that if the right kind of woman breeds with the right kind of man, then you remove all these problems from society. The issue is the woman here who was feeble-minded. For progressives who are working to develop a social safety net with very limited money, this says, well, we can now work very carefully to use our limited resources to the right kind of people who need it the most, and those who don't, we don't have to really fund any projects for them. Now, by 1914, 30 states have passed eugenic marriage laws. It's turned around pretty quickly, and this becomes one of the main reasons why. It coincides, of course, with D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, the first film shown in the White House by a very racist president, President Wilson. Griffith himself was the son of a Confederate colonel. In the movie, this is what resurrects the Klan. The ghosts of the Confederacy are coming back. And in the movie, there's a moment where there's a white woman of the noble South, I say with great sarcasm, who's being chased by a black soldier who's a white guy in blackface, who then goes after her and she jumps to her death off a cliff rather than be raped by the black soldier. The crowds across the US, including in the North, chanted, "Lynch him, lynch him, lynch him." And the Klan is back. To this point, the Klan had been defeated by President Grant, who had created the Department of Justice to go after the Klan and had destroyed them. But now they're back because this presidential leadership said these were good and decent people. Kolokok, this book will later appear to the Nazis, of course, as they try to mainstream what they're doing. And when you start seeing Nazi charts like this, it very much mirrors what they had read and seen in the Kolokok book. So they're learning how to project this publicly by looking at what the US had done. Another piece of the puzzle here is immigration in the US. 1900, 1915, 1.5 million immigrate to the US, including, of course, my ancestors from Ireland and Poland, as I'm sure many of you have ancestry that can trace itself back to this time period as well, which creates a backlash. And so the brief look here would be 1868, 1870, Reconstruction ends, having not done its job. The former traitors, the Confederates, are admitted back into power, whose tools, of course, are racism and anti-democratic behavior. And as they're readmitted back in without any consequences whatsoever for being traitors and defending one of the great crimes against humanity, slavery, they pick up allies. And the allies just coincidentally happen in California. At this point, the Transcontinental Railway has been built by Chinese laborers who are now in San Francisco and other places, and they're out of work. And so you immediately had people talking about, well, these poor Chinese workers are here to steal your jobs. Aha, says the former Confederate leaders, we have allies in this white racial backlash to the Chinese workers. There's actually a story where they invite Chinese workers, I think, into Tulsa, just to show that you don't have to worry about the blacks anymore. We've got them under control, but these Chinese people are going to come in and steal your jobs. It's the same technique they always use. And suddenly now you have people in California and in the South working together against what? Immigration of Chinese people. This becomes the first anti-immigration movement in the US. You're going to see 1879, Supreme Court bars Chinese and Asian Americans from citizenship. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. The cartoon from the time period, build a wall to keep them out because all the immigrants are rapists and murderers. So build a wall, keep them out, comes right from this time period. The intellectual muscle comes when people from Boston then join in who have their own separate agenda. And in this case, we're looking at the progressives, upper crust in Boston, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court, and Henry Cabot Lodge from the Senate, who have formed something called the Immigration Restriction League. They're worried that their position in society will be undermined when these rotten Irish and Italians start showing up in Boston and giving us a bad name. Lodge says race pride or race prejudice or whatever it may be called has long since ceased to be harmful. Racism is a good thing, he says. Immigration by the races who have peopled the United States is declining, while the immigration of people removed from us in race and blood is on the rise. Interesting, race and blood. These are eugenics concepts, right? That he's going to find great expression in. From the time period again, the immigrants coming in this case, the brown people, and I believe they're Chinese as well, but mostly brown, are all what? Rapists, communists, in this case, socialists and others. When you hear the lingo today about build a wall, keep them out, and you give the same reasons, this is a very long history in anti-immigration policy in the US. Today, it could have come together in the white replacement conspiracy theory that immigrants are coming in to undermine the blood of Americans. Of course, eugenics gives them the language that they need to express that hatred. As we start winding this down, what brings all these forces together in a huge movement that becomes mainstream in the scientific world? It's World War I. You need a specific trauma to make people reduce the world into black and white realities, because you can't deal with complexity when you're traumatized. And when you're traumatized, you're looking for answers. World War I will traumatize, of course, the Western world. The idea of progress, which is what the progressive era was all about, gave you the machine gun, artillery, gas warfare, the tank. It was destructive to humanity. So is there a future for humanity? There's a spiritual moral void for those who are traumatized, and fears that somehow the white race is being devastated here, almost suicidally, losing their gene pool on the Western Front. A book is going to be written, The Passing of the Great Race, by an American, Madison Grant, in 1916, the middle of World War I. And what race is he talking about that's disappearing from the world? The white race in Europe. And you see this reflected, too, in Field Marshal Hindenburg's diary at the same year, where he says, how will we ever know which Aryan race is superior if the French keep using black colonial troops? So this is part of the mainstream thinking of those in power at the time. So World War I will radicalize the United States. President Wilson, again, a racist president who will segregate Washington, et cetera, who brings in the birth of a nation. He had talked before becoming a president, when he was still a professor, about the ever deteriorating genetic material of America. By 1916, he's describing Italian Americans and Irish Americans as potential national threats, where he says they have powered the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life. And if you look at World War I, you're going to see a lot of arrests of hyphenated Americans under this wartime scare that they aren't truly Americans. December 1916, Wilson calls for such creatures of passion, things they can't control because it's in the genes, disloyalty and anarchy, to be crushed. Enter Madison Grant, who writes The Passing of the Great Race. This is what brings them all together. And what he argues is this. As an American, he says, this all began with the French Revolution. This is kind of how we started the presentation, one of the great traumas, right? That somehow people think they're all equal. He says this as an American who lives in a democracy, albeit not a perfect one at the time, but that's his belief. I reject this idea of equality, because the Jews are the ones who are coming from the great swamps of Poland that are behind all of this. All of what? Immigration. The Jews are conspiring to let immigrants come in to pollute the white race. The Jews started World War I to pollute the white race. He'll be quoting a source you might be familiar with in a second. And he says, unchecked immigration is a threat to American survival, even though American immigration has plummeted 75% because of the U-boats. They're not coming in because of World War I. It doesn't matter. So World War I threatens the Nordic race and its survival, and lower class Europeans are coming in and outbreeding us. So these feeble-minded, poor, lower race people, such as Negroes and Jews, should be annihilated and sterilized. It should be done through the public health system. You should put them in ghettos. Does this all sound familiar at all? Hitler will later call this his Bible. And it's the first foreign language book he has translated into German in 1933. Madison Grant, back in the Eugenics Record Office, is very excited about what he reads, and he writes them. And he says, the laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit. I'm sorry, I haven't got to Eugenics Record Office. I jumped ahead here, sorry. But he writes, Madison Grant, that the laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit. Human life is valuable only when it is of use to us, which sounds very much like Eugene Fisher in Southwest Africa. And then here's Davenport, who writes a letter to Grant. Our ancestors drove Baptists from Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island into Rhode Island, but we have no place to drive the Jews. They burn witches, but it seems to be against the mores to burn any considerable part of our population today. Here are an American advocating for the burning of Jews because they're behind a eugenics pollution movement. Hitler studies Grant. He's fascinated by the US, though he has only a superficial knowledge about it. He begins to concentrate on American eugenics laws. As the only country having Nordic pride in its politics, he cites Grant in many of his speeches before he becomes the Fuhrer. He writes Grant a fan letter, which is on his bedside when he commits suicide in 1945, one of his most prized possessions. So before Hitler comes to power in 1933, in a speech, he admires how Americans gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000, keep the rest in a cage. His Lebensraum of Race and Space, to quote Doris Bergen, plans for the Wild East include murder, reservations, and an economy built on slavery. Why is he using the term Wild East? He's imagining the Germans creating their empire like the Americans did in the Wild West. And in fact, when they crossed the Volga River to attack the Russians in 1941, he says, we have crossed our Mississippi River. So his imagination is being fueled by what he perceives to be the American reality. So we're now going to bring it all together: racism, white supremacy, anti-immigrant movement, and anti-Semitism. October 1919, you have the 18th Amendment, which is about prohibition. What does prohibition have to do with the eugenics movement and all the things we're looking at? If you look carefully at what we're looking at here, the Irish guy who shows up with the saloon, the white man's burden, or non-essential people who is the Italian guy with his booze, you start to see things like the drunkard is subject to tuberculosis, venereal disease, delirium tremors, and general debility. Those are eugenics terms. And indeed, these ideas are reinforced by the great forgery that comes out in 1902-03 out of Russia, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this made up false farcical tale about how Jews try to control the world. If you look at the protocols, one of the protocols, of course, this is the man who popularizes the protocols, I think more than anyone else, Henry Ford in the US. One of the protocols, of course, is alcoholism. That the Jews are behind this international plot to take over the world by using alcohol. And so those who are now involved in the prohibition movement can find also arguments to favor them. It's also interesting to note that in the protocols, this Jewish secret plot to overthrow the world, it also enclosed that the Jews give women equal rights. So again, misogyny becomes always part of these racist movements. So 1917, US passed the Asiatic Barred Zone, and vast selections of Asia are designated as undesirable or idiot. Eugenics terms now being applied to immigration policy. U.S. immigration begins to close down. 1921, a committee is formed, and immigration is 3% of a given nationality, up to 385,000 per year to enter. But by 1924, that standing committee codifies the law of immigration with the 1924 immigration quota system that says only 2% of a given population can come into the U.S. To a total of 164,000 per year. Those that were allowed in are Aryan people, Nordic people, Scandinavians are very much encouraged to come to the U.S. Other lesser races include Jews in the imagination of these people. Representative Albert Johnson, who is the chairman of this committee, a Republican, interestingly enough, threatens the Jews who are protesting these anti-immigration laws. They're very vocal, especially from New York, trying to say, no, this is going to hurt people, including our ancestors and our friends. And he threatens them with deportation, actually. It's interesting that Johnson's a member of the KKK. So the KKK are the ones writing our immigration laws, which now for the first time are becoming restrictive. Before this, it was open. The slogan of the Klan from 1922, America First. And here they are in a rally in Washington in 1925, no longer having to wear their hoods because they're so mainstream. Johnson appoints Harry Laughlin from the Eugenics Record Office as his expert on eugenics because the immigration policy is going to be all about eugenics, the right people versus the wrong people. Italians, for example, are reduced to 2,600 a year, Greeks down to 100 a year. And this is also supported not only by the Klan, but by the Immigration Restriction League out of Boston. So you have a lot of different people jumping into the boat. And Hitler pays close attention. He writes Mein Kampf in 1925. He says the US is terrific because they're simply excluding certain races. We can learn from them, he says. He notes that the US states divides inhabitants into three categories. These are his terms in Mein Kampf: citizens, nationals, and non-citizen nationals. Nationals I've highlighted. You're going to see this term come up again in just a minute. Nationals are, for him, Black and Indigenous Americans who have citizenship rights, but not full citizenship rights. We know about Jim Crow, inability to own a mortgage, to vote, to move, all that kind of thing. So he admires the Americans and the KKK, of course, who use immigration acts to keep the undesirables out. His second volume of Mein Kampf that isn't published focuses on the 1921 and 24 U.S. immigration laws as a model for German immigration law. In 1933, the KKK is active in all 48 states. By estimates, 10% of Indiana are members of the Klan, 11 governors, 16 senators. It's a major force whose legacy is still felt today with the white replacement theory. This, of course, I'm now going to use Fox News, but it's not exclusively from them. But Stephen Miller and, of course, Tucker Carlson. Carlson would constantly talk about the threat to the white race by immigrants who are coming in to pollute our society, making it mainstream again. Tommy Lahren claims immigrants are carrying diseases, says watching them get tear gassed at Thanksgiving was the highlight of their Thanksgiving. Laura Ingraham, there's a whole series of folks doing this. It gives them very good ratings. And he talks about the global elites who control stuff, of course, a code word for the Jewish conspiracy. August 2019, 3 days after the mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, by a white supremacist whose manifesto talked about Hispanic invasion of Texas, Carlson tells his viewers that white supremacy isn't a real problem at all. In other words, murder is okay, so long as you're doing it to the lesser races. Conspiracy theory that Jews support immigration as sort of this international plot based on the protocols to undermine the white race is what is being mainstreamed here. And of course, it has direct and lethal impact. So when you have the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, I know many here might have friends at the synagogue. I know I did. A white supremacist shot up the Tree of Life synagogue because he believed George Soros, who has now replaced the Rothschilds family from the protocols of Elder Zion, was somehow helping this community, help refugees. Imagine that American decency of helping refugees come to our country. But to them, that was part of the international plot to undermine white America. And he said he was inspired by what he'd heard on right-wing media. And the attack on our Capitol, of course, that anti-democratic attack on January 6th was fueled by white supremacists. The protocols were being given out on the Capitol steps. We know that from January 6th. So as we wind this down, legally, something dramatic happens in 1927 that now makes this legally mainstream in the US. And it's this particular case, Buck versus Bell. The plaintiff is a 17-year-old girl, Carrie Buck, who was raped by a member of her step family, most likely her step cousin or something. Anyway, she is raped by him, and she's institutionalized. Why? Because as a woman, she must have been overly flirtatious, bringing this on herself. And for those who are cringing, like I am at that very statement, you know where this is going. She is diagnosed as feeble-minded, a moron, and therefore she is forcibly sterilized against her will. That's a violation of the 14th Amendment, so she sues. When the trial is taking place, the experts are brought in from the Eugenics Record Office. Arthur Esterbrook comes in and he says, I can tell you right now that Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded moron. And they go, how do you know? What's the evidence? I've talked with her. It's fairly obvious. That evidence was submitted because he's an expert, that she in fact was a moron. Supreme Court rules 8-1 that forced sterilization of U.S. citizens is not prohibited by the Constitution, by the 14th Amendment. Overturns, of course, equal protection. And in that, this is all hereditary. They now go back and find her mother and forcibly sterilize her. The judge of the case is our Boston Brahmin Immigration League restrictionist Oliver Wendell Holmes, known for support of individual rights and judicial restraint, but he rules here that this was necessary for the protection and the health of the United States. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. And the famous line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. You should know that this law is still the law on the books. And of course, this ends all the assaults against sterilization laws that are taking place, mostly from the Jewish community at the time. And now it becomes mainstream. Doors wide open. Eugenics Record Office has a boon of activity. They then start legislating all across the U.S. To my neck of the woods, Vermont, who gets their sterilization law in 1931. And by 1937, on the eve of World War II, 2 in 3 Americans favor forced sterilizations of morally defective people. So we now end with what the Nazis do. Their race hygiene or eugenics program, of course, closely tied with anti-Semitism. When Rudolf Hess, who writes down Hitler's ramblings, was asked, define Nazism for me, it's chilling. He defines it in a sentence, and he says, well, Nazism is applied biology. In a speech to Nazi doctors immediately upon becoming the chancellor, I cannot do without you for a single day, he tells the doctors, not a single hour. If not for you, if you fail me, all is lost. And Hitler now projects himself here in 1935 as the doctor of the German people, scientifically, medically, making us a stronger and superior race. Which means, let's tie this all together and kind of wrap it up. How does Nazi sterilization law connect to what we've been looking at? The last piece of the puzzle, and it's hard making this all sort of linear because these things are kind of floating in and out, is what happened during World War I in 1917. For the first time, the United States had all kinds of people gathered at a large collection of military bases, many of whom were recent immigrants, and therefore perfect to be tested about their intelligence levels to prove eugenic theory. And so in this case, almost 2 million soldiers are given an IQ test, which is basically in English. It also is done in pictures, but mostly in English, about current events of mostly the upper white classes in America. And of course, they had no idea what the heck they were talking about. And then as the results came in, darker peoples of Southern Europe and the Slavs are clearly less intelligent, and we have the evidence of these IQ tests to prove it. Well, of course, they don't speak English fluently, have no idea what they're answering. And in this case, too, it goes a little further. Those Black Americans, mostly who had migrated north, who had an education, outperformed poor whites in the South. Something about education being really important is ignored by eugenic science, which is why public education, I think, is currently under massive frontal assault in our country. Education is really the great leveler, the great evener here. What's important about this data is that this becomes the major data resource bank for Nazi Germany. When they start writing their eugenics books, they tap into these tests, not the ones necessarily from the Eugenics Record Office, which they really can't get access to, but they get access to these. Fisher, Bauer, and others write a book, Human Hereditary and Race Hygiene. Almost all the data they use comes from the US Army tests. Harry Laughlin, 1922, working at the Eugenics Record Office, writes a book, Eugenic Sterilization in the US, where he describes in his ideal world, his model sterilization law that he said right now can't be applied in America because we haven't organized things yet. It's too ad hoc, but he advocates to sterilize people to end poverty and crime. The state should have the right to sterilize people considered genetically inferior, feeble-minded people, et cetera, under state supervision in prisons and almshouses. And defectives, he believes, he makes this all up, can be cut from 10% of the population to 1.32% by 1985. That's 1922. Buck versus Bell is 1927. So this isn't possible until 1927. In 1907, for example, Indiana passed its first mandatory sterilization law that was overturned in 1921. When did it become mandated in Indiana again? 1927. So once the Supreme Court rules that this is legal, all this stuff now comes back in full. And the last piece of the puzzle now, as we tie in Nazi sterilization laws and the connection to the Eugenics Record Office, is this. July 14th, 1933, Bastille Day. The Nazis are an anti-democratic, anti-revolutionary movement in their mind, meaning French Revolution or the Enlightenment. And the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, and they list the groups here they're going to basically sterilize. Most of this is based on US standing precedent. And the evidence is that Harry Laughlin gets a text of the sterilization law before it becomes public in Germany as a thank you, because they read his book about the model sterilization law and are about to put it in practice in Germany. Laughlin is thrilled and flattered. And what's interesting, at the same time, his ideas aren't taking off in the US. In fact, there are protests against them. So it's starting to bubble up against them in the US, but it's taking off in Germany. The text of the German statute reads almost like the American model sterilization law. The irony is why the Germans aren't publishing it yet and why they tell him first. The Pope is on a visit to Germany, and they're trying to create a concordat between the Vatican and German Catholics, right? Give Hitler more power. And the Catholic Church was opposed to racism. They believed everybody can be converted. And so they weren't on board. So they had to keep this quiet until the concordat was done. Pope believes, then it becomes published, but Laughlin knew all about it. What does the German require? It's everything Laughlin had asked for. Surveys and field data, special courts, using state-run institutions, et cetera. And most importantly, hereditary health courts, which never happened in America, but now become standard in Germany. For Laughlin, this gave you the legal cover. If people ask, is this stuff unscientific or weird? No. It goes through a real legal process of experts who are looking at it. It's basically cover for what happens. 250 courts in Germany are set up that will sterilize 400,000 Germans. The field measures you're having taken here model what the Eugenics Record Office was doing in the 1920s. You're going to see here on the left, these are the laws that basically are quoted from Laughlin's model sterilization law, who to sterilize, and the Germans take the book and they make it part of their law. To make it, this is that process of making it more popular. This is a poster saying we're not alone in doing sterilization and eugenics policy. And the first country they quote as their example is the United States. So this isn't fringe stuff, but for the Germans, it's spot on. 1933, Hitler sends a memo to the Prussian Ministry of the Interior and says, how do we make eugenics laws that are becoming very effective apply to Jews? Because Jews tend to be white. Jews tend to be assimilated in Germany at the time. To whatever degree that's true, how do we apply it to them? June 1934, Hitler's Minister of Justice, you might know Roland Freisler, chairs a committee of lawyers to craft those laws. Just as an aside, a B-17 drops a bomb in his head and he dies during the war. I'd just like to point that out. But they begin this meeting by discussing what they learned by studying the United States. And they start talking about what works and what doesn't. They literally say Jim Crow is too radical for Nazi Germany in 1933, 34, and 35, meaning there are still, quote unquote, moderates in the German legal system who are kind of pushing back. In the US, you have elected judges and sheriffs who are racist. You know, there's no pushback there at all. They're saying that really won't work here yet, not that we don't aspire to it. Doctors and politicians begin to focus on race hygiene and race defilement, and shaped on the idea that Jews are the carriers of all disease. 1934 to 35, their textbook here, a quarter of it is devoted to US legislation against targeted groups. The question really becomes, I have about a couple of slides left, how to make German Jews into Black Americans. In other words, America has learned how to make Black Americans second-class citizens. How can we do that to Jews? That's what this committee, I think, is looking after. Eugene Fisher helps to develop the justifications. Propaganda posters, the Rosh Hashanah race defiler here, the Jew stereotype seducing the innocent German Aryan woman is also Black. This morphing together of Black and Jew becomes very important for the Nazis. There's another history behind that. Here, friendship between an Aryan and Black woman, the result is a loss of racial pride. These are Nazi charts looking at what the US was doing. We're looking here at states that have sterilization laws, or on the right-hand side with statutory restrictions on intermarriage. 30 US states. And the last thing we remember, I guess, in this presentation is at that time, Germany was the leading medical community of the world. They were far advanced than anyone else. And if anybody wanted credentials, you went and studied in Germany. So they're the initiators of things like banning smoking. He does not devour it. Sorry, it devours him. The anti-smoking campaign begins here. Mothers and maternity not drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes as a way to make the baby safer starts here. And here is Goering himself talking about vivisection of animals. We forbid experiments on live animals, and all the animals are Sieg-heiling back to him. What does all this have in common? Two things. We want to create the Aryan master race, so the medical profession has a role to play. But the Nazis connect all of this to the Jewish conspiracy. The Jews are the ones who smoke. The Jews are the ones who have alcohol. The Jews are the ones who do animal vivisection and all this kind of stuff, right? So this all becomes part of the anti-Semitic agenda. It's all identified as part of the Jewish conspiracy, undermining the health of the race. You go after Jewish doctors by making them sexual predators and pedophiles in the golden mushroom, or the poisonous mushroom, a children's book, and immediately break that bond between doctors and German families. Interviewing a German SS doctor after the war, when asked by an inmate how he could reconcile Auschwitz's smoking chimneys with his Hippocratic oath, he says, "Of course, I'm a doctor. I want to preserve life, and out of respect for human life, I would remove a gangrenous appendix from a diseased body. The Jew is the gangrenous appendix." So you're going to see as doctors mainstream this very quickly. Very few are restricted by their Hippocratic oath because they see themselves doing a duty to the nation. Which now leads us to the end, which is the Nuremberg Laws. September 1935 has two main parts. The Reich citizenship law, which strips Jews of full citizens and makes them nationals. Have you heard that term before? Hitler's Mein Kampf, he mentions nationals as his designation for American blacks. So this is the moment, in my view, where the Nazis have succeeded in making German Jews into American blacks. The law for protection of German blood and honor forbids intermarriage with Jews to end race defilement, and the country leading in laws forbidding intermarriage is the United States. U.S. race chart here, 1916, the Nuremberg chart here, all very similar. And German doctors consider this a huge milestone, and to celebrate the passing of the Nuremberg Laws, their celebratory trip is to New York City, the home of the eugenics movement. Of course, they made a mistake coming to New York City because they were instantly rejected by New Yorkers. There's a great story there as well, but they travel elsewhere in the US. And intermarriage becomes legal in 1967. And we'll leave with the end here because my time is out. Sort of the epilogue. When the Nazi doctors had tried at Nuremberg, their defense is, we weren't following orders. It was, we were following the laws of the United States. Why are we on trial? They cite Buck versus Bell. They cite the immigration laws. And of course, this is Hitler's doctor, Karl Brandt, who's involved in T4. He's hung in 1948. The rest you can read on your own, but I want to just give you the appendix here, which is, you can see now, 2013 onward, a gradual repealing of sterilization laws in the US. We're now in that phase, but it's not guaranteed. And Buck for Bell is still the law in the books. So I am out of time, but thank you for your attention.